Today's daf is daf samach tes, and we have this last case over here, which is going to be a machlokas beis Hillel beit Shammai, and that is shama via v'hefer. So the father was made for the neder. Lo hispik habal lishmoa ad shemes. The Baal died, and now the question is whether or not we can apply the principle of nisrokna, in which the reshus of the Baal is now bequeathed to the father, and he can now step into the shoes of the Baal and be mefer. So the first opinion is that of Beit Shammai, choser ha'av u'mefer chelko shel Baal, that will apply the principle of nisrokna. And with the death of the Baal, the schus of the Baal to be mefer the neder of his wife is now transferred and bequeathed to the father. And the father now steps into the shoes of his son-in-law and now does the hafara. That is the opinion of Beit Shammai. Now, in this case, the Av will be mefer the chelik of the Baal. He doesn't have to repeat his hafara because he's still alive and well, so his hafara is still valid, it's still active. But we need now the hafara from the Baal, which we cannot get. Instead, the Av will step into the shoes of the Baal and be mefer. So the second hafara of the Av is not the same as the first hafara, because the second hafara is bimkom habal. It's on that schus that the Av inherited from the Baal. Amar Rav Nosson, hein divrei Beit Shammai. This makes sense according to Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai, we'll see, is of the opinion that megiz gayis. But Beis Hillel omrim ein yochel lahofer. The father cannot be mefer, and we're not going to apply nisrokna here to project the Yerusha of the schus habal onto the Av. We cannot do so, says Beis Hillel, and that's going to be based on what's called miklish kolish. So let's try to understand what the Gemara is saying over here. If you hold megiz gayis, which is the shita of Beit Shammai, then basically what happens is the following. The father, when he was mefer his half of the neder. Let's say she took a neder not to eat two zaysim, so he was mefer the neder on one zayis. We now have a full-fledged neder vis-a-vis the second zayis, and the schus to be made for that neder on the other zayis lies in the hands of the Baal. When the Baal dies, nisrokna reshus habal la'av, and that schus of the Baal is now transferred over and inherited by the Baal, by the Av. However, if we hold not megiz gayis, and we don't split the neder into two parts, but rather it's one whole entity that's indivisible, but miklish kalish, there's a chalashem aklasha on the neder as a result of any hafara, whether it's the Av's hafara or the Baal's hafara. In this case, it was the Av. He was mefer. He impacts, well, we say in Yiddish, tuzoy, a haklasha on the neder. Now, once there's a haklasha on the neder, then we cannot apply the principle of nisrokna. Why? Because the neder is not a full-fledged neder. And in order to be morish, in order to bequeath that schus on the neder, in this case from the Baal to the Av, we can only do so if it's a full-fledged neder. If the neder is already called a neder shehuklash, then it doesn't have the same status. For example, we said earlier on the previous Amud that if she would violate the neder after one hafara, she would not get malchus because it's not the same neder. And the principle of nisrokna only applies if it's a full-fledged neder. According to Beit Shammai, everything's fine, as we said before, because the hafaras of ha'av is not maklish the neder. It only has an impact on half the neder. The other half of the neder is a full-fledged neder that lends itself to nisrokna. Now we can answer the original question that we raised in the suffix about hafaras habal or hafaras ha'av, whether it's Megis Gaiz or Mikush Kolish. Lebeit Shammai Megis Gaiz, and Lebeit Hillel Mikush Kolish. Shma Mina, and this is how the Gemara concludes. Now, what we'd like to do now is give a little bit of a summary of all the various scenarios that we discussed yesterday on Daf Samach Ches, together with this last scenario here on Daf Samach Tes. So we'll go according to the following order. First, we'll start with Nisrokna. And in the case of Nisrokna, we have 4 different scenarios of Nisrokna. The first is where the Baal was not aware of the neder and he died. The second is where the Baal heard about the neder. He was shosek, and he died on that very same day. The father likewise heard about the neder, and he was mefer. The third scenario of Nisrokna is where the Baal heard about the neder, he was mefer the neder, and then he died. So that when the father heard about the neder, the Baal had already died. And before the Av had a chance to be mefer his chelik, the Baal now transfers through his misa the zchus hafar of the Baal over to the Av, and that's Nisrokna. Now, before we get to the fourth case of Nisrokna, let's just point out that if the Baal heard about the neder and he was makayim the neder, or he was shosek a full day, then there's no Nisrokna. Why? Because then the Baal achieved before his death exactly what he wanted to achieve, and he was makayim the neder, so that the Av now picks up a neder that's already makuyam, and therefore he cannot be made for that neder. Now, here's the last case of Nisrokna. The Baal heard about the neder, he was made for the neder, and the Av did not even hear about the neder. Now the Baal dies. And once again, we're going to apply the principle of Nisrokna Rishus La'av, and the Av is now going to have to repeat the hafar of the Baal. Why? Because since the Baal heard about the neder, he was made for it, but he died, his misa now negates the hafara, so that with Nisrokna, the Av is going to have to be made for not only his own chelik, but also his son-in-law's chelik, the Baal's chelik. Okay, now we're going to switch it around, and we're going to apply the principle of lo Nisrokna, which means that the father died. So this means that the father heard about the neder, was made for the neder. Let's say the Baal didn't hear about the neder. The father dies. Can the Baal now be mefer not only his chelik, but also the chelik of his father-in-law and the father? No. The answer is no, because Nisrokna only works in one direction, from the Baal to the Av, but not from the Av with his misa to the Baal. Then we have the following case. We have a case where The Baal heard about the neder. He was made for the neder. The father did not hear about the neder, and he died. Can the Baal now step up to the plate and be made for the chelik ha'am? And the answer is no, because a Baal could never be made for the chelik of his father. A Baal could only be made for b'shutfus. And now we finally get to the last scenario, which we discussed here today on Samach Tes. The father heard about the neder and he was made for the neder. The Baal did not hear about the neder, and he died. So the Baal dies, and l'chora, we would apply the principle of nisrokna, and now the father just has to present the second hafara as a substitute for the Baal, but no. That works out well according to Beit Shammai, where the father could be made for the chelik of the Baal, because Beit Shammai are of the opinion that Megis Gayis, and therefore the neder is still a complete neder vis-a-vis the other half, and that neder on the other half lends itself to nisrokna. So when the Baal dies, he transfers his power of hafara over to the father. However, Beit Shammai would say in this case that the father could not be mefer, because Beis Hill, I meant to say, because Beis Hill are of the opinion that miklesh kolush, and once the neder in its entirety becomes kolush, then you no longer can apply the principle of nisrokna, because the neder is not considered chashuv. We mentioned, for example, there's no malchus for violating that neder, and such a neder cannot lend itself to nisrokna. We go on. Now, we know that there's something called she'elas chacham or hataras chacham, when a noder comes in front of the chacham and he says, you know what, if I had known so-and-so, I never would have taken the neder, and therefore the chacham, or shalosh hadyotos, are matir the neder. Boy, Rav wants to know, yesh she'ela behekem, or ein she'ela behekem? Does the status of hakama, insofar as it validates the neder, equal the status of the neder itself? It's ke'em ha-neder atzma. And therefore, just like there's halacha of she'ela on a neder, there should be a halacha of she'ela on hakama. So if, let's say, the father, or alternatively the husband, was making the neder, and on that day that he was making the neder, he shows up in front of the chacham, and he expresses his charot, his regret on being making the neder. So the chacham can be mevatel la'akama, which is basically a neder, because the hakama is what makes the neder into a neder. Oh, Dilma, perhaps ain't she'ela behekem. Why is there no she'ela behekem? So the Rosh explains that heter nedarim comes from lal yachel dvaro, acherim mochlim lo, and that's a Gemara Chagiga Daf Yud. That drasha only applies to a neder and not to hakama. However, Rabbeinu Avram and the Meiri quote a Rashi that Rava's suffix is about the following: a nara murasa, the father was makayim the neder, or the Baal was makayim the neder, and the other one now takes the bas or the isha over to the chacham to be matir the neder. And one side of the suffix of Rava is that machmas hakomas ha'echad ein she'el neder. He can't be shol in the neder when there already was hakoma. Or should we take the second side and say that since she'ela is matir a complete neder, it could certainly be matir a neder that's incomplete because the hakama is not enough to clinch the neder. So if a total neder that's absolutely valid lends itself to she'ela, how much more so a neder where there was only one participant between the Av and the Baal, and the neder is not complete. Rava says the following: Imtim saloma yesh she'ela behekem. Even I grant you that there is she'ela on hekem because hekem is like the neder itself, and therefore lends itself to she'ela. Yesh she'ela behefer, or ein she'ela behefer. Can there be she'ela after hafara? So the father was Mephir or the Baal. Can they show up in front of a chacham to be mevatel and invalidate their hafara? So the neder now will go back to its original state of token. There is she'ela on hekem. Hekem is like a neder itself, lends itself to she'ela, but not hafara. Now, the Ran explains that the tzad in the Gemara that both hakama and hafara lend themselves to she'ela is based on the pasuk Isha Yikimena Isha Yifirena, and based on a sugya later on in Ayin Vav and Beis, we have here a hekesh between hafara and hakama and hafara. So if we come to the maskana, as Rabbi Yochanan did, that hakama lends itself to she'ela, then therefore ipso facto, by virtue of the hekesh, hafara likewise lends itself to she'ela. However, the other side in Rava's Safek is that the hekesh between hakama and hafara goes just so far, but not as far as she'ela. Now, what is the logical reason, if we can sort of speculate, as to differentiating between hakama and hafara? Why does hakama lend itself to she'ela and not hafara? So I thought that the answer to this question might lie in a chiddush of Reb Chaim Brisker, which I saw quoted here in the back of the Masifta. In the Otzer Hayunim, on page Tzadi Hey. Now, this Chiddush of Reb Chaim is a little bit premature for us. I'll try to add it on Daf Samad Tes Samad Beis in a few minutes from now, but I just want to borrow one concept. And he says the following, that there's a fundamental difference between hafara achar hakama and hakama after hafara. So again, I'm not going to go into all the details. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. But Reb Chaim wants to say that the reason why it's not shaykh to be mekim and neder after hafara is because Kevon sha neder hufar eno kayam. The ein shaykh lahakim neder she'eno kayam. This is Reb Chaim's lumdus. That hafara completely removes the neder. If the neder is not there, then you can't be making the neder. So ein hakama achar hafara because of the absence of the neder. So I was thinking that maybe that's why there's no she'ela on hafara, because once the hafara was expressed, then the neder is gone. It's history. So how can you now be shoel on a hafara in order to reinstitute a neder once it's gone? In any event, boy Rabba. Now we have another case of boy Rabba, which means that Rabba is continuing his train of thought. And he has the following suffix. A Baal says to his wife, or a father says to his daughter, regarding the neder, Kayam lichi, Kayam lichi. He was Makayim twice. Now the question is, the second kiyum seems to be totally superfluous and meaningless. However, Rabba thinks that maybe the second akama is kind of a fallback position. It's like a cavalry that's waiting in the back in the closet and will jump out. Nishal al akama rishona mau. Now he removes the first akama. Does the second akama now emerge from the dark shadows and it's chal as akama? He writes here, do we say that lo haya akama shniya makom lachu, since the akama shniya in its time could not be chal, there was already akama that took over the space. Yishuvein of chala afilu im b'tela rishona, because it couldn't be chal in its time. Oh, Dilma, could we say that afal gav de b'shaita lo ayala akama shniya makom lachu, and in its time, but it's still suspended in the air, hovering, looking for a place to land. Once he was shown on the first akama, now motza la, she, meaning the afara shniya, finds a makom lachu. Farehi chala. I'm sorry, I said afara shniya. I'm sorry, stand corrected. Hakama shniya. Now, this suffix of Rava could not be relevant to two afaros, because we just finished establishing in the name of Yochanan, Lamaskana, that a nishalam al afara. But you could be shoel on akama. So therefore, the second suffix of Rava is built on the conclusion of the first suffix of Rava, that since we concluded that nishalam al hekem, he could be shoel on the first hekem, and now the second hekem would emerge from the shadows and be chal because it has a makom lachu. Tashma diyoma Rava, and the Mishnah says that if a person took a shvua twice, shvua shelo ochal kikar zu, shvua shelo ochal kikar zu. So the halacha is that he's only going to be chayav for violating the first shvua. The second shvua cannot be chal on the first shvua because ain't shvua chal shvua. So he'll only get one set of malchus if he goes ahead and he eats the kikar. Says Rava, back on Daf Yudches, im nishal al harishona shniya chalala. If he'll be shoel on the first shvua, then the second shvua will be chal. So you see that the second shvua hovers like a helicopter over the air and waiting for a place to land. When you remove the first shvua, the second shvua will be chal. And the Gemara makes the analogy, the same thing. If he has one akama and another akama, he's shown the first akama. Now the second akama will be chal. Boy Rabba. Kayam lichi mufra lichi. V'lo techal hakama elim ken chala afar. He sets up a t'nai that the hakama depends upon the afar. So one thing is crystal clear, and this is not in the purview of the suffix that Rava vacillates about, and that is the hakama cannot be chal. Why? because there's no such thing as hakama after hafara. And this hakama depends upon the hafara. So we might have shown. If the hafara is chal, then there's batel, and there's no room for hakama. And if the hafara won't be chal, the hakama can't be chal because the hakama was set up as a t'nai that the hakama would only be chal if the hafara is chal. So no matter how you slice the cake, this hakama can't be chal. So what is the suffix of Rava? He's going to be misapik on the hafara. Shall we say the following? That although he never explicated a t'nai vis-a-vis the hafara, but by implication, we understand that he wants a t'nai on the hafara, just like he wanted a t'nai on the hakama. So again, he never said it outright, leheja, but there's an implicit t'nai, and he wants to be masna on the hafara, that the hafara won't be chal unless first the hakama will be chal. And once the hakama is chal, there's no room for the hafara to be chal. Or should we say no? He didn't mention a t'nai on the hafara. He only mentioned a t'nai on the hakama. On the hafara, he lo hisna klum. He didn't make any t'nai, and therefore the hafara is chal. And once the hafara is chal, and the hafara could be chal independent of the chalos hakama, then the hakama can't be chal because the neder is already mufad. Now watch what happens over here. He starts by saying, Kayem lichi umufar lichi. And then he adds a t'nai. So the Ran points out, and you'll find this apparently in many, many Rishonim, that if he had not added the t'nai of lo tochel hakama elim kein chala hafara, if he had omitted that t'nai, there would be no suffix in Rav. It would be pshita that hakama would be chal. Why? Because he started with hakama. Now later on we'll see on Daf Samapes Omid Beis that Rabbi Yossi holds that af bigmar dvarav adam nitfas. But when do we apply the principle of Rabbi Yossi af bigmar dvarav adam nitfas? That's when there's room for both chalosim to be chal. We'll see it in the case of Ola and Shlomin. So it's efshel kayim shneim biyachad, and therefore we're going to take the sof dvarav and add it to the tchilas dvarav. That's Rabbi Yossi. But in a case where once we start with tchilas dvarav, we cannot, it absolutely undermines and contradicts the sof dvarav, then even Rabbi Yossi would agree tfos lashon rishon. And tfos lashon rishon in this case would mean that the kiyum haneder came first, and there's no room for hafaras nedarim. So what was the tzaddik to say that the hafara could be chal, since he didn't make a t'nai on the hafara, but rather on the hakama? And as we said, once he makes a t'nai on the hakama, there's no way the hakama could be chal. So now the hafara could be chal because he didn't make a t'nai on the hafara.